Buried beneath Egyptian soil lay a forgotten metropolis that rewrote history. For centuries, Avaris flourished as a cosmopolitan port, where Egyptian and Levantine worlds collided. Watch how Asiatic migrants transformed a humble village into the glittering capital of the controversial Hyksos dynasty. Foreign kings who ruled Egypt from decorated palaces adorned with Minoan frescoes. Witness their innovative military revolution, introducing horses and chariots to Egyptian warfare, before Theban pharaohs launched a bitter liberation campaign that erased Avaris from memory. Only modern archaeology would resurrect this lost city, challenging everything we thought we knew about ancient Egypt's relationship with outsiders. In the far reaches of northern Egypt, where the Nile River fans into countless channels before meeting the sea, the landscape was unlike any other in the ancient world. This vast delta stretched out as a quilt of wetlands, fertile fields, reed marshes, and narrow waterways twisting toward the Mediterranean. It was both a blessing and a frontier. Farmers sowed barley and emmer wheat in the dark, silty soil left behind by the floods, while fishermen cast nets into shallow pools brimming with perch and catfish. Papyrus grew thick along the banks, harvested for rope, mats, and the very sheets upon which scribes would one day record the history of kings. Yet beyond its bounty, the delta was also a place of shifting borders and uncertain loyalties. It was here, in this watery maze, that the story of Avaris would begin centuries later. Though the Nile Valley to the south had already been united under the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, the delta remained more fluid. Its settlements were scattered, small villages clinging to raised mounds, safe from floodwaters. Local chiefs managed affairs rather than great pyramids or centralized bureaucracy. Archaeological traces from this early period, around 2500 BC, reveal modest mud brick dwellings and cemeteries, signs of a rural life shaped by the river's cycles. The Pelusiac branch, the easternmost channel of the Nile, carried more than water. It carried wealth. Flowing toward the northeastern corner of Egypt, it provided access to the Sinai and the trade routes beyond, linking the land of the pharaohs with the Levant and, indirectly, Mesopotamia. Whoever held this passage controlled the lifeline between Egypt and Asia. Caravans wound their way through the Wadi Tumilat, a natural corridor cutting eastward into the desert. From there, travelers crossed into Canaan, bringing with them timber, copper, and fine oils, and returning with gold, linen, and Egyptian grain. Over time, this exchange etched invisible lines of connection between delta farmers and merchants far away in Byblos or Mari. In these early centuries, long before Avaris rose to prominence, the delta was already serving as Egypt's doorway to the wider world. Not all the newcomers came as merchants. Some arrived as laborers or shepherds, drawn by the abundance of land and pasture. The Egyptians called them Amu, a general term for Asiatics from the east. Their arrival was not a flood, but a trickle, families moving in, settling at the fringes, sometimes working under Egyptian officials, sometimes forming their own clusters. Archaeologists working at Tel El-Daba, the site that would later become Avaris, have uncovered the earliest phases of this story. In the layers known as stratum H and G, dating roughly to this era, they found traces of small settlements, pits, huts, and scattered pottery sherds of both Egyptian and Levantine style. Already, the seeds of cultural blending had been planted. The delta's geography encouraged this mingling. Unlike the Nile Valley, where cliffs and desert hemmed in the fields, the delta opened onto open horizons. Marshlands stretched endlessly, and the Mediterranean coast lay close. Egyptian farmers could not fence themselves off entirely. nor could rulers in Memphis fully police the border. Traders slipped in with donkeys laden with goods. Nomadic groups found water and grazing land. The Egyptians tolerated and sometimes encouraged these movements. Foreigners were useful as mercenaries, caravan drivers, or craftsmen. Their presence also kept the frontier alive with commerce, which enriched local towns. Still, the delta was a challenging environment. Villages had to adapt to the annual rise and fall of the river. Entire hamlets might be relocated when floodwaters shifted channels. Fields had to be constantly reclaimed, embankments reinforced, ditches dug to guide irrigation. Life in the delta required resilience and flexibility. This constant adjustment mirrored the shifting identities of those who lived there. Egyptian villagers worshipped the traditional gods of the Nile, Osiris, Horus, and Hathor, but they also encountered foreign deities brought by their neighbors. Some of the earliest imported cult objects, amulets of Near Eastern style, appear in the archaeological record at this time. The Pelusiac branch itself, running past the site of future Avaris, gained importance precisely because it offered an open artery for both goods and people. Cedar wood from Lebanon, prized for shipbuilding, floated down to delta docks. Copper ingots traveled across Sinai from the mines of Timna. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carried first to Mesopotamia, made its way westward, eventually reaching Egypt through these channels. The delta was becoming a node in a sprawling network of Bronze Age exchange, though its towns still looked humble compared to the grandeur of Memphis or the pyramid fields at Giza. What made this corner of Egypt different was not monumental architecture, but its role as a threshold. For centuries, the Egyptians had built their identity on the contrast between Kemet, the fertile black land along the Nile, and Deshret, the barren red land of the deserts. Yet here in the delta, the categories blurred. Foreigners could settle, trade, and sometimes prosper without losing their distinct traditions. Over generations, these groups left marks visible in burials and pottery styles. At Tel el-Dabba, cemeteries of this era contain bodies laid to rest in both Egyptian and Asiatic fashion, some in traditional Nile Valley poses, others in crouched positions typical of Canaanite custom. The story of the delta before Avaris is, then, one of gradual layering. Egyptian farmers laid the foundation, cultivating the fertile fields. Asiatic migrants added new customs, crafts, and connections. Together, they created a mixed community that was neither wholly Egyptian nor wholly foreign, but something in between. It was in this crucible that Avaris would later rise. The city's eventual prominence as the Hyksos capital, its docks filled with foreign ships, and its temples devoted to gods from beyond Egypt. All of this had roots in these earliest centuries. Even before palaces stood at Tel el-Dabba, the ground was already primed by centuries of cultural exchange. When later generations looked back at the Hyksos as invaders, they forgot how long Asiatics had been part of delta life. The seeds of hybridity, sown in the quiet days of fishing boats and barley fields, would one day blossom into one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the ancient Near East. As the Middle Kingdom emerged, and Egyptian kings reasserted control over their realm, they looked northward with both opportunity and caution. The delta was fertile, rich, and connected, but it was also porous. The same channels that carried cedar and wine could also bring foreign powers into Egypt's heartland. It was only a matter of time before one of those migrant communities grew strong enough to challenge the pharaohs themselves. That challenge, and the city it created, would be remembered for centuries. What began as a landscape of marshes and scattered villages would soon transform into a hub of international trade, a place where Egyptian and Asiatic worlds converged. In the layers of Tel El Daba's earliest strata, archaeologists can still see the moment before the storm, when the delta was simply a land of promise, waiting for history to claim it. The turn of the second millennium BC brought new currents into the eastern Nile delta. Egypt's Middle Kingdom rulers, proud of the order restored after the turbulence of earlier centuries, looked to the delta both as a resource and a frontier. They valued its fertile lands, its access to the trade corridors of Asia, and its strategic role as Egypt's shield against incursions from the east. Yet they also knew it was a porous borderland, impossible to control with complete precision. Into this setting, groups of foreign migrants began arriving, not in sudden invasions, but in steady, patient trickles that would transform the character of the region and lay the groundwork for the city of Avaris. The newcomers were largely Canaanite and Levantine in origin, hailing from towns scattered across what is today Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. Driven by droughts, by the lure of fertile soil, or by the pull of Egypt's prosperity, they led their families and flocks southward. Egyptian scribes referred to them collectively as the Amu, the people of the East. To the Egyptians, they were outsiders, but not necessarily enemies. The kings of the 12th dynasty, reigning from their new capital at XIII, saw practical value in this migration. They sought to manage it, encouraging foreigners to settle as workers, soldiers, or craftsmen under state supervision. A controlled influx of labor could help build canals, tend fields, or reinforce garrisons. Tel El Daba, situated on the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, became one of the focal points of this movement. Archaeologists have uncovered housing from this period that bears unmistakably Levantine features. Broad, rectangular courtyards, with multiple rooms clustered around central open spaces. These were not Egyptian designs, but Syrian-style dwellings transplanted onto Egyptian soil. The pottery tells the same story. Locally made Egyptian vessels sat alongside jars and cooking pots fashioned in foreign styles, sometimes imported, sometimes imitated by immigrant potters. In the soil layers of stratum F and E, the marks of cultural mingling are unmistakable. Life in these early settlements was not merely about survival. Trade flowed steadily through the delta, and the Asiatic newcomers took active roles in it. Some became caravan drivers, moving donkeys laden with copper from Sinai, cedar wood from Lebanon, and fine oil and wine from Canaan. Others became artisans, producing goods for both Egyptian and immigrant markets. Their skills in metallurgy, shipbuilding, and weaving added new dimensions to local economies. Over time, what began as clusters of foreign families turned into vibrant quarters that pulsed with commerce. Religion, too, bore the marks of blending. The Asiatics brought their own deities, Baal, Resheph, Anat, gods of storms, war, and fertility. They erected small shrines or carried protective amulets. Egyptians living alongside them saw these cults and, in some cases, folded them into their own pantheon. At Tel El Daba, archaeologists have found both Egyptian-style cult chapels and objects with Levantine motifs. The seeds of the later Seth-Baal syncretism, which would become so central in Hyksos Avaris, were already being sown in these centuries. The landscape of the delta, with its patchwork of villages, marshes, and trade routes, encouraged coexistence. Egyptian villagers farmed their fields, while Asiatic herders grazed their flocks nearby. Fishermen shared the waterways. Markets, no doubt, echoed with multiple tongues as locals and migrants exchanged grain, oil, and livestock. Marriages bound families together, creating households where Egyptian and Levantine traditions blended. The resulting culture was neither wholly one nor the other, but something in between. a frontier identity that mirrored the delta itself. At times, however, this growing presence of foreigners stirred unease. Egyptian texts from the Middle Kingdom show hints of ambivalence. On one hand, the state employed Asiatics as mercenaries and celebrated the wealth brought by Asiatic trade. On the other, stories circulated that cast the Amu as tricksters or potential rebels. The famous Tale of Sinuhe, a Middle Kingdom literary work, describes a nobleman who flees Egypt and lives among Asiatics, portraying them as both hospitable and dangerous, their lands both appealing and alien. Such stories reflect the tension in Egyptian attitudes, admiration for foreign skills, coupled with suspicion of their loyalties. Despite this wariness, the state continued to harness the benefits of migration. In the reign of Senusret III, one of the strongest 12th dynasty pharaohs, fortresses were built in Nubia to the south, and trade with Asia intensified to the north. The delta communities, infused with Asiatic blood, served as natural intermediaries in this process. The pharaohs could levy taxes, recruit soldiers, and reap the profits of trade without having to micromanage every village. For the migrants, the arrangement was advantageous. Access to Egypt's fertile soil and protection under its kings, while still retaining much of their cultural identity. Burial practices at Tel el-Daba shed striking light on this hybrid world. Some graves from this period follow traditional Egyptian custom, with bodies laid out extended, surrounded by amulets of gods like Osiris or Hathor. Others, however, follow Levantine patterns. Bodies crouched or flexed on their sides, accompanied by donkey burials, a custom rooted in Canaanite ritual. These animal sacrifices, rare in Egypt, appear repeatedly in the Delta cemeteries. They stand as testimony to the persistence of Asiatic traditions and their acceptance within local communities. Such mingling of customs foreshadowed the multiculturalism that would later define Avaris itself. The economic impact of this settlement was profound. Caravans grew larger, docks busier. Donkeys became symbols of prosperity, the engines of long-distance commerce. Ships sailed from delta harbors to Byblos, laden with grain and textiles, returning with cedar beams and luxury goods. Inscriptions from Byblos even speak of Egyptian officials and merchants stationed abroad, while Levantine traders resided in Egyptian towns. Tel el-Daba, perched at the heart of these networks, evolved from a modest village into a bustling hub. Over the centuries between 2000 and 1800 BC, the balance of power shifted slowly. Egyptian overseers may have maintained ultimate authority, but Asiatic communities carved out ever larger spaces for themselves. Their leaders gained prestige, their gods found followers, their merchants accumulated wealth. By the time the 13th dynasty came to power, Egypt's grip on the delta was loosening. Fragmentation in the royal house created openings for ambitious local elites. Within this unstable landscape, the Asiatic settlers of Tel el-Daba were poised to rise further. The dawn of Asiatic settlement, then, was not an invasion, but a gradual embedding. It was a story of families arriving with herds and crafts, finding space in Egypt's delta and shaping the region with their customs and connections. The Egyptians themselves enabled it, welcoming the skills and goods the newcomers brought. Together, Egyptians and Asiatics built a frontier society that was more complex, more cosmopolitan, and more fragile than the simple villages of earlier centuries. When later chroniclers wrote of the Hyksos as alien conquerors, they erased this long prelude of coexistence. They forgot that before there was a Hyksos dynasty in Avaris, there were generations of Asiatic villagers ploughing delta fields, raising children, praying to their gods, and mingling with Egyptian neighbors. Without their steady settlement, the city of Avaris could never have emerged as the cosmopolitan capital of the 15th century BC. As the next era approached, the Delta was no longer merely Egypt's doorway to Asia. It had become a crossroads in its own right, a place where identities blurred and where foreign migrants were no longer simply guests, but part of the land itself. The marshes and mounds of Tel el-Dabar now hosted a thriving, mixed community. From these roots, a city of international stature was ready to grow. The age of Avaris was on the horizon. By 1800 BC, the eastern delta was no longer a quiet landscape of scattered hamlets. At Tel el-Dabar, the Asiatic village that had begun humbly 2 centuries before, a transformation was underway. What had started as a frontier community of mixed Egyptian and Levantine families was growing into a place of strategic and economic significance. With each passing decade, more ships docked along its banks, more caravans wound their way through the Wadi Tumilat, and more wealth flowed into its markets. The village was becoming a city, and soon it would be known by a name that would echo across history: Avaris. The Pelusiac branch of the Nile made this transformation possible. Flowing like a highway through the delta, it offered both security and reach. Docks were extended, some built with timbers imported from Canaan, others with sturdy Egyptian mud brick. Archaeologists have discovered remains of harbors large enough to accommodate ships of considerable size, their designs reflecting both Egyptian and Levantine building traditions. Evidence of ship timbers, anchors, and cargo residues at Tel el-Dabar speaks of a thriving maritime hub. Trade connected Avaris to the great ports of the Levant and beyond. Ships from Byblos unloaded cedar wood, prized for shipbuilding and monumental construction. Vessels from Cyprus carried copper ingots, essential for the production of bronze. Tin, more difficult to source, traveled along overland routes from as far as Anatolia or even Afghanistan, arriving in Egypt through Canaanite merchants. Luxury goods also flowed into the harbor: ivory from Syria, perfumed oils from the Levant, finely crafted weapons, and amphorae filled with wine. In return, Egypt exported what it had in abundance: grain, linen textiles, papyrus, and gold from the mines of Nubia. The harbor was alive with motion. Donkeys brayed as caravans arrived from the east, their backs laden with metals and exotic goods. Porters carried amphorae from ship to warehouse, while scribes sat nearby, tallying every delivery on clay tablets and papyrus rolls. Egyptian overseers recorded shipments for taxation, while Asiatic merchants haggled in lively voices, their dialects mixing with the Egyptian tongue. Avaris had become the kind of place where no one language or custom could dominate entirely. The city's rise also demanded protection. Early in the 18th century BC, fortifications began to appear around Tel el-Dabar. Archaeologists have uncovered defensive works, walls, embankments, and ditches that suggest the settlement was recognized as a prize worth defending. Whether these defenses were built to ward off rival communities, to guard against raids from the desert, or to symbolize rising prestige, they marked a decisive step in Avaris's transformation from town to city. Religion, too, mirrored the city's growing stature. Egyptians in the delta worshipped Seth, the god of storms and deserts, whose chaotic nature fit the unpredictable frontier. Among the Asiatics, Baal held similar dominion as a storm and war god. In Avaris, these two deities began to merge. A modest temple was built in honor of Seth, but inscriptions and artifacts suggest that Levantine worshippers saw Baal in his figure. This early stage of religious syncretism foreshadowed the deep blending that would later define Hyksos Avaris. Processions likely wound through the streets on feast days, carrying statues of the storm god whose protection was sought by farmers, sailors, and warriors alike. The economic role of donkeys deserves special mention. Before horses were introduced into Egypt, these hardy animals carried the bulk of trade across desert routes. Excavations at Tel El Daba have revealed donkey burials associated with Asiatic families, proof of their ritual and economic importance. Caravans of these animals transported copper and tin, linking the harbour of Avaris with the inland routes to Sinai and beyond. In this way, the city served as a hinge between maritime and overland trade, drawing prosperity from both. Archaeological layers also reveal growing social complexity. The homes of wealthier families were larger, with storage rooms and decorated courtyards, while common labourers lived in simpler mud brick houses. Evidence of workshops shows specialised craft production, potters firing both Egyptian and Canaanite-style wares, smiths shaping bronze tools, artisans carving seals and amulets. These products were not only for local use, but also for export, carried abroad as symbols of Avaris mixed culture. Scarabs, in particular, became a specialty. These small beetle-shaped seals, inscribed with names and motifs, circulated across Egypt and the Levant, marking contracts and serving as amulets. Their presence in far-off sites from Syria to Nubia underscores the city's expanding influence. Beyond material goods, ideas also traveled through Avaris. Techniques of shipbuilding, artistic motifs, and religious practices crossed borders in the hands of merchants and migrants. Fresco fragments found in later levels suggest early contacts with Minoan Crete, even before the most famous bull-leaping scenes were painted. Such exchanges hint at the city's role as a cultural bridge, transmitting influences across the eastern Mediterranean. For Egyptians elsewhere, the Delta city must have seemed both promising and unsettling. It was undeniably useful. It brought wealth into the kingdom, foreign goods that enhanced royal prestige, and a population that could be taxed and conscripted. Yet it was also undeniably foreign. Its streets rang with unfamiliar accents. Its temples honored gods not entirely Egyptian, and its leaders included men who traced their lineage to Canaan, rather than the Nile Valley. This dual identity would eventually become both its strength and its vulnerability. By 1700 BC, Avaris stood as one of the great ports of Egypt. Its harbours buzzed with trade, its warehouses overflowed with imported goods, and its population swelled with Egyptians, Canaanites, Syrians, and others from across the Levant. The small settlement of a few centuries earlier had become a metropolis by Delta standards. It was no longer just a frontier village. It was a city with regional importance, a place where Egypt met the world. The rise of Avaris did not occur in isolation. Political instability in Egypt's royal house, especially during the later 13th dynasty, created opportunities for local powers to grow. As pharaohs struggled to maintain their grip on Upper and Lower Egypt, the elites of the Delta gained autonomy. In Avaris, this meant that wealthy Asiatic leaders could consolidate influence, shaping the city not only as a trading hub, but as a budding political center. What began as harbours and houses was now becoming a capital in waiting. Foreign scarabs bearing the names of Levantine rulers appear across the city, evidence of diplomacy stretching eastward. Fortified walls enclosed growing neighborhoods. Religious life centered increasingly around the storm god Seth Baal, whose dual identity reflected the city's multicultural character. Avaris had become a jewel of the eastern delta, shimmering with wealth and promise. Yet its very success planted the seeds of conflict. Egypt's southern rulers in Thebes watched uneasily as foreign power rose in the north. They saw Avaris not only as a gateway of wealth, but as a potential rival. In the century to come, that rivalry would erupt into open war. But for now, in the 18th century BC, Avaris stood at its peak as a flourishing port city, a crossroads of nations, and the beating heart of a frontier that belonged both to Egypt and to the wider world. The bustling city that had risen in the delta was thriving when new rulers appeared on the horizon. Avaris had already grown into a place of wealth and diversity, but its growing independence and foreign character made it fertile ground for ambitious outsiders. Power in Egypt was shifting. The central authority that had once commanded pyramids and fortresses was weakening, and the great 13th dynasty was unraveling into short-lived reigns and rival claimants. In that political vacuum, a new force began to shape the delta, the Hyksos. The name by which history remembers them comes from the Egyptian phrase Heka Kasut, meaning rulers of foreign lands. To Egyptian scribes, this was not originally a dynastic label, but a description, a way of identifying leaders whose roots lay beyond the Nile Valley. Over time, the title became attached to a ruling line that took Avaris as its capital and reshaped Egypt's political landscape. Whether they arrived as invaders or infiltrators has long been debated, but the evidence suggests something more gradual. Families from the Levant had been living in the delta for centuries, as the archaeological record at Tel el-Dabba makes clear. By the early 17th century BC, some of their leaders had risen high enough in wealth and prestige to claim kingship. Rather than storming Egypt with armies, these Hyksos chieftains likely advanced step by step. As native Egyptian rule faltered, the foreign elite of Avaris consolidated power. They may have first ruled as governors or military strongmen, controlling the vital Pelusiac branch of the Nile, and taxing the trade routes that funneled wealth into the delta. From there, the transition to kingship was not abrupt but incremental, with one title after another claimed until their authority was difficult to challenge. What once had been a trading city was becoming the capital of an emergent dynasty. The historical record preserves a handful of names, though each is shrouded in mystery. The earliest was Salitis, remembered by later historians as the founder of the Hyksos line. He was followed by leaders such as Benon, and later by Kian, one of the most influential rulers, whose scarabs have been found as far afield as Crete, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia. This wide distribution shows that under Hyksos rule, Avaris maintained and even expanded its international reach. After Kian came Apophis, whose reign was long and eventful, and finally Kamudi, the last Hyksos ruler known by name. These kings, though foreigners in the eyes of many Egyptians, established themselves firmly in the delta, surrounding themselves with palaces, temples, and armies. Archaeology confirms the dramatic expansion of Avaris during their rise. The city sprawled across hundreds of acres, with distinct quarters for Egyptians, Asiatics, and elites. Palatial architecture appeared, including grand halls with columned courtyards, storerooms for tribute, and workshops for artisans. Temples expanded, with Seth Baal worship elevated to royal importance. Fortifications grew more imposing, reflecting not only wealth, but also the need for security. The Hyksos rulers, whatever their origins, were no longer outsiders on the fringes. They had become kings in their own right, presiding over a cosmopolitan capital that could rival Thebes in the south. The question of how their rule was viewed within Egypt is complex. Some regions, especially in the delta, accepted or even welcomed them, seeing stability and prosperity under their oversight. Others resisted. In Thebes, Egyptian rulers of the 17th dynasty looked northward with growing hostility, regarding Avaris as an affront to tradition and foreign usurpers of the two lands. Between these poles of acceptance and rejection, ordinary life in the delta carried on. Farmers ploughed their fields, sailors navigated the marshy waterways, and merchants tallied their profits, now under Hyksos oversight. What made the Hyksos distinctive was not just their foreign origin, but the innovations they carried with them. From the Levant came the horse and chariot, a revolutionary tool of warfare that Egypt had never seen before. Composite bows of Asiatic design, stronger than Egyptian self-bows, appeared in their arsenals. Bronze armor and curved swords added to their military edge. These technologies did not simply appear overnight, but their refinement and systematic use under Hyksos kings gave them formidable strength. Avaris was not just a trading hub anymore. It was a military power. Scholars continue to debate whether the Hyksos should be seen as conquerors or as opportunists who capitalized on Egyptian weakness. What is clear is that they did not sweep in from nowhere. For centuries, Asiatics had lived in the delta, rising in wealth and influence. The Hyksos kings were heirs to this gradual integration, representing the point at which foreign leaders could claim Egypt itself as their domain. The image of sudden invasion, painted later by Egyptian propaganda, obscures the slower truth of social transformation. Yet for all their pragmatism, the Hyksos rulers also sought legitimacy. They adopted Egyptian royal titles, employed scribes to write in hieroglyphs, and presented themselves as pharaohs in the traditional sense. Their monuments bore both Egyptian and Levantine styles, blending symbols of two worlds. On scarabs and seals, their names appear framed in Egyptian cartouches, the mark of kingship. At the same time, they maintained their own cultural identity, honoring foreign gods and preserving Levantine traditions. This duality, Egyptian in form, foreign in spirit, defined their reign. From the docks of Avaris, their influence radiated across the eastern Mediterranean. Scarabs bearing Khayan's name, found in sites from Crete to Baghdad, testify to a trading empire of extraordinary breadth. Envoys must have traveled regularly, exchanging gifts with rulers abroad. The Hyksos court received goods and ambassadors from distant lands, reinforcing Avaris's image as a cosmopolitan capital. In this way, the Hyksos not only controlled Egypt's delta, but also wove it more tightly into the international networks of the Bronze Age. The rise of these rulers set the stage for one of the most dramatic chapters in Egyptian history. For the first time, Egypt was ruled in part by foreigners, men whose ancestors had once been welcomed as migrants. Their reign would last for generations, reshaping Egypt's military, economy, and identity. But it also planted seeds of resentment. The pharaohs of Thebes would not tolerate a rival dynasty forever. Conflict was inevitable, and when it came, it would decide the fate of Avaris itself. For now, though, the city stood at the height of its early power. Avaris was no longer merely a port or a frontier town. It was the royal seat of kings who called themselves masters of Egypt. Palaces gleamed, ships crowded its docks, and armies trained within its walls. The storm god Seth Baal was worshipped with pomp, and foreign merchants brought riches to its markets. The Hyksos arrival had changed everything, ushering in a new order in which the delta, once Egypt's margin, became the center of power. From the moment the Hyksos secured their authority, Avaris was transformed. What had been a thriving port became the royal court of an entire dynasty. Palaces rose above the marshlands, temples multiplied, and the docks expanded to handle the constant flow of goods. The city did not merely host foreign rulers, it became the embodiment of their power. To walk through its streets in those years was to see a metropolis where Asiatic and Egyptian worlds intertwined under the rule of kings who styled themselves pharaohs, yet carried the memory of distant homelands. The palaces left a strong impression. Excavations at Tel el-Daba have revealed the remains of monumental residences, the largest known as Palace F, built of mud brick but with imposing scale. It contained columned halls, storerooms, courtyards, and reception chambers. Some rooms were decorated with brightly coloured plaster, and drainage systems suggest concern for comfort and hygiene. This was no makeshift seat of power, but a carefully planned royal complex designed to project authority. Surrounding it were administrative offices where scribes recorded tribute, sealed documents with scarabs, and managed the city's bureaucracy. Temples dedicated to Seth, interpreted by Asiatic worshippers as Baal, stood nearby. The storm god was honoured with sacrifices, festivals, and public ceremonies. At these gatherings, priests and musicians led processions through the streets, while crowds offered prayers for protection from storms, fertility of the fields, and success in war. Religious life in Avaris was therefore both Egyptian and foreign, uniting worshippers of two traditions in the cult of a hybrid deity. The Hyksos court was not only ceremonial, it was also military. Horses and chariots, introduced from the Levant, were kept in the city's stables. Chariot technology revolutionized Egyptian warfare. Teams of horses could pull light vehicles with speed and maneuverability, allowing Hyksos forces to dominate the open plains. Alongside this innovation came the composite bull, crafted of wood, horn, and sinew. Stronger and more flexible than the simple self-bows of earlier Egypt, it gave Hyksos archers a deadly advantage. Bronze armor, helmets, and curved swords, known as kopesh, added to the arsenal. Avaris became not just a hub of trade, but a fortress of military innovation. Bureaucracy supported this system. Hyksos officials employed seals and scarabs in great numbers, leaving behind hundreds of artifacts that testify to a structured administration. Scarabs bore the names of kings like Kian and Apophis, as well as symbols of power and divine favor. They were pressed into clay to secure jars, mark ownership, or validate decrees. The sheer number of scarabs found at Avaris reveals an organized system of record-keeping, taxation, and control. The city was not a loose confederation, but a state with centralized power. The wealth concentrated in Avaris was extraordinary. Imported pottery from Cyprus, ivory inlays from Syria, and gold ornaments adorned elite households. Banquets filled the halls of the palace, where nobles reclined on couches while musicians played harps and flutes. Wine from the Levant was poured into fine goblets, and platters of roasted meat were served to honored guests. These scenes, reconstructed from archaeological finds and later Egyptian depictions, show a court that rivaled the splendor of Thebes in the south. Yet outside the palaces, life continued for ordinary citizens. Farmers in the surrounding delta brought their harvests into the city, selling barley, wheat, and vegetables in crowded markets. Fishermen unloaded baskets of fresh catch from the Nile's backwaters. Craftsmen hammered bronze tools, spun flax into linen, and baked bread in communal ovens. In the multicultural quarters of Avaris, Egyptian and Asiatic families lived side by side, speaking different languages but sharing streets, markets, and festivals. The city was alive with diversity, a frontier melting pot that reflected its dual heritage. The docks were perhaps the most vibrant part of Avaris. Ships tied up along wooden jetties, their sails furled after journeys across the Mediterranean. Cargoes were unloaded by long lines of workers, overseen by scribes tallying every amphora and ingot. Cedar timbers, too large for a single man to carry, were dragged ashore for use in construction. In return, ships departed, loaded with Egyptian grain, papyrus, and linen. The harbour of Avaris was thus the heartbeat of an economy that connected Egypt with Cyprus, Crete, and the Levant. All of this activity reinforced the prestige of the Hyksos kings. Khayan in particular stands out. Scarabs inscribed with his name have been discovered as far afield as Babylon, Crete, and Anatolia. This astonishing distribution proves that Avaris, under his rule, maintained an international presence equal to the great powers of the Bronze Age. Diplomats and merchants travelled in both directions, carrying news, gifts, and goods. The Hyksos dynasty, though foreign in Egyptian eyes, had carved a place for itself on the global stage. Still, not everyone accepted their legitimacy. To Egyptians loyal to native dynasties in Thebes, the Hyksos were usurpers. They might adopt royal titles and cartouches, but they lacked the divine lineage of Horus that pharaohs traditionally claimed. The propaganda of later Egyptian kings would cast them as oppressors who defiled temples and enslaved Egyptians. Archaeology paints a more nuanced picture, showing coexistence, prosperity, and cultural blending. Yet the tension between the foreign court in Avaris and the native dynasties in Upper Egypt simmered beneath the surface. For the time being, Avaris flourished. Its palaces stood as symbols of power. Its temples echoed with hybrid worship, and its docks tied it to the wider world. Soldiers trained in the use of chariots, scribes stamped scarabs into clay, and merchants filled markets with goods from across the Near East. To live in Avaris during Hyksos rule was to dwell in one of the most cosmopolitan cities of its age, a place both Egyptian and foreign, rooted in the Nile, yet looking outward across the seas. This golden age of Hyksos dominance, however, carried within it the seeds of conflict. The Theban princes, increasingly resentful of foreign rule, would one day strike back. But for now, in the middle of the 17th century BC, Avaris stood proud as the jewel of the Delta, the capital of foreign kings who had made Egypt their own. The grandeur of Avaris during Hyksos rule was not measured solely in its palaces or its armies. What set the city apart was the way it absorbed, reshaped, and displayed culture. Nowhere else in Egypt did so many traditions converge so visibly. It was a frontier capital where Egyptian, Levantine, and Mediterranean influences overlapped until they became inseparable. For those who lived in Avaris, daily life was defined by this cultural fusion. The houses of the city bore witness to this mingling. Excavations reveal neighborhoods divided not by walls, but by traditions. Some quarters contained Egyptian-style houses, rectangular rooms, central courtyards, and shrines to local gods tucked into niches. Others reflected Asiatic patterns, with broad open courtyards, surrounded by clustered rooms and multiple entrances. Within these homes, pottery of mixed origin was found, Egyptian red-polished vessels sitting alongside Levantine amphorae, and Cypriot bowls decorated with spirals and birds. To walk through Avaris was to step through a shifting patchwork of architectural and cultural identities. Art flourished in this environment. The most striking evidence comes from fragments of wall paintings discovered in the palatial district. These frescoes depict bull-leaping scenes, dolphins, and spirals in vivid blues and reds, unmistakably Minoan in style. Scholars debate how they arrived in Egypt. Some suggest Minoan artists traveled to Avaris to decorate the Hyksos palaces. Others believe the Hyksos imported the frescoes as a demonstration of international taste. Whatever their origin, they show that the court of Avaris was connected directly to the Aegean world. No other Egyptian city of the period displays such art, making Avaris a true Mediterranean crossroads. Religious life also revealed the city's dual identity. The cult of Seth, already strong in the Delta, was reshaped by Asiatic influence into Seth Baal, a composite storm god embodying both Egyptian and Levantine qualities. In temple rituals, priests may have spoken in Egyptian, but the imagery on votive objects carried Levantine symbols. Worshippers could see in Seth Baal both the chaos-bringing deity of the desert and the storm lord who brought rain to the Levant. For Egyptians, this syncretism was unusual, even unsettling, but for the inhabitants of Avaris, it was natural. In a city where multiple cultures coexisted, gods blended as seamlessly as languages. Burial customs offer further evidence of fusion. Cemeteries in Avaris display both Egyptian and Asiatic practices. Some graves show extended Egyptian-style burials, accompanied by amulets of Osiris and scarabs inscribed with protective formulas. Others feature crouched burials, a Canaanite tradition, often accompanied by donkey sacrifices. These donkey burials, found repeatedly in the necropolis, highlight a distinctly Asiatic ritual rarely practiced in the Nile Valley. To the Hyksos and their subjects, such customs reinforced identity while coexisting with Egyptian religious elements. Death, like life, was a blend of traditions. Material culture reflects the city's diversity in other ways. Scarabs were mass-produced in Avaris, inscribed with royal names, divine symbols, or geometric patterns. These small objects traveled far beyond the Delta, turning up in archaeological sites across the Levant and even Cyprus. Amulets of Near Eastern gods, pottery with Aegean motifs, and Egyptian-style faience beads all circulated in the same markets. Workshops in the city produced goods for local use and for export, spreading Avaris' hybrid style across the eastern Mediterranean. The city was not homogeneous. Archaeologists can distinguish between Egyptian quarters, where traditional Nile Valley customs dominated, and Asiatic quarters, where Levantine traditions were preserved more fully. But these districts were not isolated. Trade, intermarriage, and shared festivals ensured constant interaction. Children grew up speaking more than one language, learning Egyptian hieroglyphs in school while hearing Levantine dialects at home. In marketplaces, bargaining required switching tongues easily, as merchants from Cyprus, Canaan, and Upper Egypt mingled. Festivals were perhaps the most vibrant moments of cultural interaction. On feast days for Seth Baal, processions filled the streets with music and incense. Egyptians brought offerings of bread and beer, while Asiatics added oil, wine, and incense imported from their homelands. Songs blended styles, with Egyptian flutes joining Levantine lyres. Such events made the city's dual heritage visible and celebratory rather than divisive. Archaeology even hints at stratification between elites and commoners along cultural lines. The Hyksos rulers and their noble allies embraced a mixed identity, adopting Egyptian royal titles while preserving Levantine traditions. Their palaces contained Minoan frescoes and Egyptian symbols side by side. Commoners, meanwhile, might cling more tightly to their ancestral customs, whether Egyptian or Asiatic. Yet despite these distinctions, the shared identity of Avaris as a multicultural city was undeniable. The importance of this cultural fusion cannot be overstated. It shaped not only Avaris itself, but also the trajectory of Egyptian civilization. Technologies and ideas introduced through the Hyksos, the chariot, the composite bow, new bronze working methods, would eventually be adopted by Egyptians across the land. Religious syncretism would influence later cults. Trade networks established in this era would continue into the New Kingdom. Avaris was thus not just a foreign enclave, but a laboratory of cultural exchange whose impact reached far beyond the Delta. At the same time, this cosmopolitanism carried risks. To many Egyptians, particularly in Thebes, Avaris appeared foreign, un-Egyptian, even dangerous. Its gods were unfamiliar, its rulers of alien blood, its customs unsettlingly different. While the people of Avaris celebrated their blended identity, those in Upper Egypt saw corruption of tradition. This tension would one day erupt into war, but in the early 16th century BC, Avaris flourished in peace. The city's identity was unlike anything Egypt had known before. It was a place where bull-leaping frescoes decorated palaces, where donkey sacrifices sanctified burials, and where the storm god of two cultures presided over a diverse population. It was both Egyptian and Asiatic, yet neither fully. Avaris under the Hyksos was a symbol of hybridity, a city that lived at the intersection of worlds. For its inhabitants, this hybridity was not strange. It was simply life. Merchants traded in markets where amphorae from Cyprus sat beside Egyptian jars. Priests led ceremonies that honored gods with dual identities. Children grew up with stories from both the Nile and the Levant. Such daily realities forged a civic identity that embraced difference as strength. In doing so, Avaris set itself apart from every other city in Egypt. But hybridity alone could not shield the city from the political storms gathering in the south. The princes of Thebes, heirs of the old Egyptian line, looked northward and saw in Avaris not a shining example of cultural exchange, but a foreign stronghold that threatened the unity of the two lands. The cultural fusion that defined Avaris would soon become one of the very reasons for its downfall. The glittering palaces and bustling markets of Avaris hid a growing fault line. For all its wealth and cultural vitality, the Hyksos capital was a symbol of foreign domination. In the marshes of the Delta, the Hyksos kings thrived, but in Upper Egypt, Theban rulers nurtured resentment. They claimed to be the true heirs of Egypt's divine order, stewards of the gods and defenders of tradition. From their southern stronghold, they began to challenge the Hyksos grip on the north. The city of Thebes had risen steadily through the turmoil of the Second Intermediate Period. By the late 17th century BC, the 17th dynasty ruled there, holding sway over Upper Egypt, while the Hyksos controlled the Delta. For years, this uneasy balance endured, but as Avaris flaunted its prosperity, Theban kings grew restless. The storm god Seth Baal may have protected Hyksos ships, but the gods of Thebes demanded vengeance. The clash of two dynasties was no longer a question of if, but when. One of the earliest sparks came with Seqenenre, a Theban ruler remembered for his tragic end. His mummy, discovered millennia later, bears ghastly wounds. Deep axe cuts to the skull, a crushed cheek, and gashes from Hyksos weapons. He died violently, likely in battle against Hyksos forces. His body tells the story of the first serious Theban challenge, an early campaign that ended in defeat and the death of a king. Seqenenre's sacrifice, however, transformed him into a martyr for the cause of liberation. Tensions were not confined to the battlefield. Stories preserved in later texts suggest that Avaris and Thebes traded insults as well as blows. A tale known as the Quarrel of Apophis and Seqenenre recounts how the Hyksos ruler, Apophis, complained about the noise of hippopotami kept in Theban pools, claiming their bellowing disturbed his sleep in faraway Avaris. The absurdity of the story The distance between the two cities made such a claim impossible. Hints at the propaganda of the age. The tale painted Apophis as arrogant and unreasonable, a foreign despot whose words justified rebellion. Meanwhile, inscriptions offer glimpses of the real campaigns. The Carnarvon tablet, a fragmentary source discovered at Thebes, recounts the deeds of Kamose, Sekenenra's successor. It describes a determined ruler who marched northward to strike directly at Hyksos territory. Kamose declared himself the defender of Egypt against foreign rulers, presenting his war not as a struggle for power, but as a fight for national survival. His proclamations reveal both his ambition and his propaganda, casting the Hyksos as oppressors and himself as Egypt's liberator. Kamose's campaign was daring. He sailed his forces along the Nile, attacking Hyksos garrisons and capturing key positions. His stelae describe how he intercepted Hyksos messengers and seized letters that revealed attempts to forge alliances with Nubia to the south. The Hyksos, recognizing the threat from Thebes, sought to bolster their strength by reaching out to the kingdom of Kerma. If Nubian armies had marched north in support of Avaris, the balance might have shifted. But Kamose's interception of these plans disrupted the alliance, weakening Hyksos prospects. The strategic value of Avaris became clearer with every clash. Whoever controlled the Delta capital controlled Egypt's lifeline to Asia, its docks, and its fertile lands. For Theban rulers, leaving Avaris in Hyksos' hands was intolerable. For the Hyksos, holding it was essential for survival. Every skirmish along the Nile brought them closer to open war for Egypt's future. The Theban campaigns were not easy. Kamose's forces may have won victories, but they did not succeed in seizing Avaris outright. Archaeology reveals no destruction layers at Tel el-Dabba from this first round of attacks. The Hyksos kings maintained their hold on the city, their walls and armies proving too strong for a decisive Theban strike. Yet Kamose's campaign changed the political landscape. He proved that the Hyksos were not invincible, and he ignited the struggle that his successors would finish. Life in Avaris during these years must have been tense. Markets still bustled, ships still unloaded cedar and copper, and festivals to Seth Baal continued, but the shadow of war hung over the city. The presence of Theban armies to the south and Nubian allies in question forced the Hyksos court into constant vigilance. Fortifications were reinforced, soldiers drilled with chariots and bows, and envoys travelled eastward to maintain ties with Levantine allies. Despite the pressure, Avaris continued to display its cosmopolitan flair. Hyksos rulers, like Apophis, presided over courts that maintained international contacts. Scarabs bearing their names reached Cyprus and Canaan, proof that trade continued even in wartime. Diplomats still exchanged gifts, and merchants still sought profit. Yet behind the opulence lay anxiety. The Theban challenge was not a passing threat. It was the beginning of a war that would determine whether foreign kings would continue to rule Egypt. The struggle between Avaris and Thebes was about more than power. It was also about identity. To the Thebans, their war was a fight for Egyptian tradition, for the gods and the memory of the pharaohs who had unified the land. To the Hyksos, their rule represented legitimacy earned through wealth, innovation, and international prestige. In Avaris, people saw prosperity and blended culture. In Thebes, they saw foreign corruption. These competing visions of Egypt could not coexist indefinitely. By the end of Kamose's reign, the stage was set. He had bloodied the Hyksos, but not destroyed them. Sekenenre Tao's death had galvanized Theban resolve, and Kamose's campaigns had exposed the fragility of Hyksos alliances. The next generation would inherit not only palaces and markets, but also an unfinished war. Avaris, proud and cosmopolitan, stood as both the prize and the battleground. For the citizens of the Delta capital, the years of Kamosi's challenge must have been filled with both defiance and dread. Soldiers marched along the streets, temples resounded with prayers to Seth Baal for protection, and rumors swirled of Theban advances. Yet daily life endured. Farmers sowed their fields, merchants traded their wares, and children played in courtyards painted with Minoan frescoes. Life carried on beneath the looming storm. The Hyksos could not yet know it, but their golden age was waning. The Theban challenge had begun in earnest, and once unleashed, it would not relent until Avaris itself lay under siege. The fragile balance between north and south finally shattered. The Theban rulers of Upper Egypt had tasted both defeat and defiance in earlier clashes, but by the mid-16th century BC, they committed themselves fully to war. Their enemy was entrenched in Avaris, a city fortified by walls, enriched by trade, and armed with the most advanced military technology of the age. For the Theban kings, victory would mean liberation and unity. For the Hyksos, it was survival. Kamose had struck the first serious blows, but his death left the struggle unfinished. Into this void stepped his successors, men determined to continue the fight. The Theban armies had learned from their enemies. No longer were they armed only with simple bows and spears. They had captured Hyksos chariots, studied their design, and begun constructing their own. Craftsmen in Thebes worked feverishly to reproduce composite bows, forging weapons that could match those wielded by Hyksos archers. In a twist of history, the very innovations that had given the Hyksos their edge were now turned against them. On the walls of Karnak, stelae were raised to proclaim these victories. Kamoses' inscriptions had already set the tone, boasting of intercepted messages and captured towns. His successors carried on the tradition, leaving records of victories along the Nile. The rhetoric was clear. This was not simply a civil war, but a national liberation. Hyksos rulers were cast as foreigners who had defiled the land, while Theban kings presented themselves as champions chosen by the gods to restore order. The fighting raged along Egypt's central artery, the Nile. Control of its towns and harbors was essential. Thebes pushed northward, seizing settlements that had long wavered between allegiances. Each conquest tightened the noose around Avaris, cutting it off from allies and resources. Hyksos forces resisted fiercely, launching counterattacks with their chariots. But Theban soldiers had learned to fight fire with fire. Their own charioteers now galloped into battle, loosing arrows with weapons once reserved for their enemies. Naval warfare played its part as well. The Nile, broad and winding through the delta, became a theatre of combat. Theban forces captured Hyksos ships, stripping them of supplies and weakening their control of the waterways. Without secure transport along the river, Avaris' lines of communication began to fray. Victory on water mirrored victories on land, demonstrating that Thebes had transformed from a provincial power into a formidable military machine. Still, the war was not won quickly. For every town that shifted to Theban control, another resisted or reverted to Hyksos allegiance. The conflict stretched across years, exhausting both sides. Farmers saw their fields trampled, merchants watched their trade routes disrupted, and ordinary families lived in fear of armies marching past their homes. For the people of the Delta, the war was not an abstract struggle, but a daily reality of uncertainty and hardship. Inside Avaris, the atmosphere grew tense. Once celebrated for its multicultural vibrancy, the city was now a fortress under siege. Workshops shifted from producing luxury goods to military supplies. Carpenters built chariots, smiths hammered bronze for weapons and armor, and priests filled the temples of Seth Baal with prayers for victory. The wealth of past decades now funded defense, as tribute and trade revenues were redirected into sustaining armies and fortifications. The Hyksos king Apophis looms large in this period. He ruled during the height of the war, rallying his forces against the Theban advance. Scarabs and seals bearing his name testify to his continued prestige, and his reign must have seen the mobilization of every resource at Avaris's disposal. Yet even Apophis could not reverse the tide completely. The pressure from the south was relentless, and each passing year saw Thebes tighten its grip. Theban propaganda painted these struggles as divinely ordained. In temples, hymns praised the gods for granting victory. Seth, who had once been honored in Avaris as Baal's counterpart, was in Thebes reimagined as a foreign corrupter, a god whose worship symbolized the Hyksos menace. In his place, Amun and other southern deities were celebrated as patrons of liberation. Religion, like warfare, became a weapon in the struggle. The impact of the conflict extended beyond Egypt. The Levant, long tied to Avaris by trade and kinship, watched nervously as its allies faltered. Some Canaanite towns may have sent aid, others likely withheld it, unwilling to risk angering a resurgent Thebes. Cyprus and Crete, once regular partners in Avaris's bustling harbour, adjusted their trade to suit the shifting balance. What had been a cosmopolitan city connecting Egypt to the wider world was increasingly cut off, its lifelines strangled by war. Yet even under siege, Avaris endured. Its walls stood firm, its garrisons fought with determination, and its people adapted to shortages. Archaeology has revealed no signs of immediate destruction during these years, a reminder that Hyksos' resilience delayed their fall. Thebes may have gained momentum, but the final victory would require a longer struggle than many expected. The war transformed Egypt. For the first time, native rulers had absorbed foreign technologies on a massive scale. Chariots thundered across the battlefield, archers unleashed volleys from composite bows, and bronze weapons gleamed in the sun. The struggle also reshaped Egyptian identity. To be Egyptian was to oppose the Hyksos, to reject foreign domination, and to unite under a single crown. This narrative of resistance would echo long after the war ended, coloring how Egyptians remembered the Hyksos for centuries. By 1555 BSC, the Hyksos had been pushed to their limits. Town after town had fallen to Thebes, and Avaris itself was isolated. Its glory as a cosmopolitan capital had given way to the grim determination of a besieged fortress. For the Thebans, the time was nearing for a decisive strike. For the Hyksos, the choice was narrowing to victory or annihilation. The great Hyksos-Theban wars were not yet finished, but their outcome was becoming clearer. Egypt was learning how to fight like its enemies, and was turning that knowledge into strength. The dynasty that rose in Thebes would soon bring the conflict to its climax, laying siege to the city that had once embodied foreign power. The struggle that had begun with insults and skirmishes was now a fight for survival. Avaris, once proud and prosperous, stood on the edge of catastrophe. The walls of Avaris had withstood years of pressure. Inside the city, life carried on under the shadow of war. Merchants still bartered, priests still raised incense to Seth Baal, and soldiers drilled in the courtyards of the palace. Yet everyone knew the siege was closing in. The Theban kings had mastered the technologies that once made the Hyksos formidable. Chariots rolled from southern workshops, composite bows bent in Theban hands, and seasoned generals now commanded disciplined armies. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Ahmose, remembered as the first ruler of the 18th dynasty, led the final campaigns. His rise to power marked a turning point not only for Thebes, but for all Egypt. Young and ambitious, he inherited the unfinished war of his father and brother. Determined to finish what they had begun, he marched north with armies strengthened by years of experience. The delta's marshes and canals slowed his advance, but they did not stop it. The campaign was systematic. Capture the towns feeding Avaris, sever supply lines, and squeeze the city until no help could reach it. One of the most vivid accounts comes from the autobiography of Amos, son of Ibana, a soldier who served in these campaigns. His tomb inscription tells of fierce battles, of ships captured, and of rewards granted by the king. He describes being present at the siege of Avaris itself, his words offering a rare eyewitness glimpse into the struggle. The Theban army attacked by land and water, pressing the Hyksos from every side. For the defenders, each assault meant dwindling supplies, rising casualties, and a growing sense of inevitability. Archaeology supports the grim picture. Excavations at Tel el-Dabba reveal layers of destruction from this period: collapsed walls, charred remains, and abandoned houses. These traces suggest a drawn-out conflict, not a single catastrophic blow. The siege likely stretched across multiple seasons, perhaps even years, as the Thebans slowly starved their enemies into submission. Refugees must have crowded the streets, food prices soared, and disease spread in the cramped quarters. A city that once dazzled with foreign goods and bustling markets became a place of hunger and fear. Despite the hardships, Avaris did not surrender easily. Hyksos kings had every reason to resist. To yield meant not only personal ruin, but the collapse of their dynasty and the loss of their identity as rulers of Egypt. Apophis and later Kamudi mustered their forces for desperate counterattacks, launching sorties from the gates, rallying allies abroad and seeking to break the siege. But their pleas to Canaanite towns and Nubian allies came too late. The Thebans had severed communication lines, and no foreign power dared risk open confrontation with the rising strength of Thebes. The final breach, when it came, must have been devastating. Theban's soldiers poured through shattered walls, clashing with Hyksos defenders in narrow streets. Chariots thundered across open squares, archers rained arrows from rooftops, and hand-to-hand combat filled the courtyards of palaces. Flames licked the walls of storerooms and temples. The gods of Avaris, once honored with festivals, watched their shrines desecrated. Ordinary citizens fled in panic, seeking escape through marsh channels or surrender at the feet of conquerors. The Hyksos retreat did not end at Avaris. Survivors fled northeast into Canaan, rallying at Sharuhen, a fortified city in the Negev. Ahmose pursued them relentlessly. For 3 years, he laid siege to Sharuhen until it too fell, extinguishing the last organized Hyksos resistance. The war that had divided Egypt for generations was finally over. With Avaris subdued and its rulers expelled, the Thebans had reunited the two lands under native control. The fate of Avaris's population is less clear. Some may have been killed in the fighting, others enslaved or absorbed into Egyptian society. Archaeological evidence suggests both destruction and abandonment. Burn layers mark violence, while gaps in habitation layers suggest sudden depopulation. Yet traces of continued settlement appear in later strata, indicating that not all life vanished. Avaris, as a royal capital, was finished, but as a garrison and town, it lingered. For the Egyptians, the victory carried profound symbolism. The Delta, once the heartland of foreign rule, had been reclaimed. Temples across Egypt celebrated the triumph. Hymns praised Amos as the liberator, and reliefs depicted him as the king who restored order. Thebes, no longer a provincial city, became the center of a new dynasty that would launch Egypt into the imperial heights of the new kingdom. The fall of Avaris thus marked both an end and a beginning, the end of Hyksos power and the dawn of Egypt's golden age. Yet memory is complex. For centuries, Egyptians remembered the Hyksos as hated oppressors, foreigners who had humiliated the land. Propaganda emphasized their expulsion as a cleansing of Egypt. But beneath the rhetoric lay a more complicated reality. The Hyksos had brought technologies that Egypt would continue to use. They had opened trade links that persisted long after their fall. Even in defeat, their legacy endured, woven into the very fabric of Egyptian civilization. Later traditions would seize upon the drama of Avaris' fall. Some would link it to the exodus of the Hebrews, imagining the Hyksos as ancestors of biblical figures. Others would cast the story as a parable of divine justice. Archaeology cannot confirm such tales, but it reveals the intensity of the conflict and the significance Egyptians attached to their victory. When the dust settled, Avaris was a broken city. Its palaces lay in ruins, its harbour silenced, its people scattered. The great capital that had once dazzled with Minoan frescoes and international trade was now a scarred reminder of foreign rule. But it was also a reminder of Egypt's resilience. From its ashes, a new age of pharaohs would rise, carrying lessons learned in blood and fire. The fall of Avaris was not just the end of a dynasty, it was a turning point in Egyptian history, the moment when Egypt reclaimed itself and prepared to stride onto the stage of empire. What had begun as a trickle of Asiatic migrants centuries earlier ended with a storm that shook the delta to its core. And though the city would fade from glory, buried beneath later settlements, its memory would never truly die. Smoke still lingered over the delta long after the final battle. Avaris, once proud capital of the Hyksos, lay scarred from fire and war. Its temples were desecrated, palaces half collapsed, and harbours choked with the wreckage of broken ships. For those who survived, life was altered forever. The fall of Avaris was more than a military defeat. It marked the dismantling of a way of life that had blended Egypt with the wider world. Ahmose I, victor of the siege, faced the task of rebuilding a fractured land. His triumph had expelled the Hyksos kings, but it also left behind a city filled with ruins, refugees, and the ghosts of foreign power. Some inhabitants fled into Canaan, carrying memories of Egypt's marshy frontier with them. Others remained, forced to adapt under the gaze of new Egyptian administrators. Archaeological evidence at Tel el-Dabba shows both destruction and continuity. While certain areas bear burn layers and sudden abandonment, other quarters continue to be occupied, their homes patched and rebuilt in the wake of conquest. For the Thebans, Avaris was too strategically valuable to abandon entirely. Situated on the Pelusiac branch of the Nile, it commanded the routes linking Egypt to Sinai and the Levant. Instead of leaving it in ruins, Ahmose and his successors repurposed the site. Soldiers were stationed in its precincts, turning the former Hyksos capital into a garrison town. Administrative buildings replaced palatial residences, their walls filled with the scribbles of tax records and patrol rosters rather than frescoes of leaping bulls. The city that once embodied foreign kingship now served as a military outpost of the restored Egyptian state. The population that remained in Avaris must have lived in tension between memory and survival. Families of Asiatic descent had been part of the Delta for generations. To them, Avaris was home long before the Hyksos declared it a capital. After the conquest, many likely blended into Egyptian society, adopting Egyptian customs while preserving fragments of their own traditions. Burials from this period suggest continuity in practices, though with stronger Egyptian influence than before. Cultural blending did not vanish overnight. It adapted under the shadow of Theban rule. The trauma of war lingered. Those who had lived through the siege carried memories of famine, bombardment, and fire. Stories of the Hyksos flight into Canaan, pursued to Sharuhan, and besieged for 3 years, must have circulated in homes and markets. For some, these tales became family legends, connecting them to distant relatives who had escaped beyond Egypt's borders. Over time, such memories may have woven themselves into larger traditions, later feeding into myths and debates about the Exodus. Economically, the decline of Avaris was stark. Once the hub of Mediterranean trade, its harbors fell quiet. Merchants who once handled cedar from Lebanon or copper from Cyprus now watched fewer ships arrive. The routes were not abandoned entirely. Egyptian kings of the New Kingdom would later reopen trade with vigor, but Avaris no longer commanded the central role. The locus of power shifted southward, where Thebes blossomed into the heart of the empire. In the delta, the once vibrant port city began to fade. Archaeological layers from this period, known as Stratum C/3, reveal smaller-scale occupation. Houses were more modest, workshops fewer, and imported luxury goods rare compared to the Hyksos era. The cosmopolitan character that had defined Avaris gave way to a quieter, provincial existence. Still, the city retained importance as a military and administrative base. Patrols guarded the eastern approaches, ensuring that no new foreign dynasty could rise in the marshes again. For Egyptians, the symbolic meaning of Avaris mattered as much as its practical use. The fall of the Hyksos capital represented the restoration of order. Every stone left in ruins, every temple rededicated to Egyptian gods, reinforced the narrative of liberation. Later inscriptions celebrated Moses' victories, emphasizing that he had purged Egypt of foreign domination. Yet in practice, the legacy of the Hyksos could not be erased so easily. Horses, chariots, composite bows, and international connections all survived, reshaped under Egyptian control. In the generations after the conquest, Avaris lingered in half-life. It was neither fully abandoned nor fully revived. The site gradually sank into obscurity as new cities rose around it. By the time Rameses II founded Pi-Rameses nearby, in the 13th century BC, the ruins of Avaris lay beneath fresh layers of construction. The once glorious Hyksos capital became the hidden foundation for a new royal city, its memory buried under the ambitions of another age. The shift from prominence to obscurity happened gradually. Avaris was not erased in a single night, but rather dimmed across decades. For local families, life may have seemed stubbornly ordinary, sowing fields, repairing houses, raising children. Yet the grandeur was gone. The sound of foreign merchants haggling in multiple tongues, the processions to Seth Baal, the glitter of Minoan frescoes, these had vanished. What remained was a town remembered more for its past than its present. The symbolic victory over Avaris shaped Egyptian memory for centuries. To later generations, it was the place where foreign rulers had been expelled, the moment when Egypt had reclaimed itself. In this way, the ruined city lived on not as a thriving settlement, but as a cautionary tale. It reminded Egyptians of the dangers of allowing outsiders too much influence, even as they continued to use the weapons, ideas, and trade routes the Hyksos had introduced. By the end of the 15th century BC, Avaris had receded into the background of Egyptian life. Its name ceased to appear in inscriptions. Its streets grew over with new constructions, and its identity dissolved into that of the Delta region at large. It had served its purpose as a garrison and then slipped into silence. The city that had once rivaled Thebes in importance, that had stood at the heart of Egypt's greatest internal conflict, was forgotten by all but local memory. The aftermath of Avaris's fall left paradoxes behind. The Thebans had triumphed, yet they built their new kingdom with the very tools learned from their enemies. The Hyksos had been expelled, yet their legacy remained embedded in Egyptian culture. And the city itself, so prominent in one generation, became invisible in the next. What remained was the story. A city that had risen from a frontier village to an international capital, only to collapse under the weight of war and politics. For centuries, Avaris's ruins slept beneath the delta soils, waiting for rediscovery. Its decline was quiet, but its memory, reshaped by propaganda and myth, echoed loudly across Egypt's history. When the dust of war had settled and the Hyksos were gone, Egypt did not simply move on. Memories of the foreign dynasty lingered, reshaped into stories, propaganda, and cautionary tales. The new kingdom, launched by Ahmose I after his conquest of Avaris, built its identity in part by remembering and demonizing the Hyksos. For centuries after their expulsion, Egyptian rulers used the memory of these foreign kings to define themselves as defenders of order and tradition. The propaganda began almost immediately. Ahmose erected inscriptions proclaiming himself the liberator of Egypt, chosen by the gods to cast out the oppressors. His successors continued this narrative, ensuring that the Hyksos were remembered less for the innovations they introduced and more for the humiliation of their rule. Stories of their cruelty and impiety circulated widely. To Egyptians of the New Kingdom, the Hyksos were not just a defeated dynasty. They were a symbol of chaos itself. One of the most striking pieces of evidence from this period is the Tempest Stela, erected during the reign of Ahmose. The inscription describes violent storms that swept across Egypt, flattening temples and devastating crops. Though the text frames the disaster as an act of nature, many scholars see in it echoes of the Hyksos period, perhaps even memories of the turmoil of war. Whether literal or metaphorical, the stela tied natural catastrophe to the age of foreign domination, reinforcing the image of a world out of balance until native kings restored order. Later, pharaohs repeated the theme. Queen Hatshepsut, who reigned in the 15th century BC, left an inscription at Speos Artemidos, in which she denounced the Hyksos as barbarians who had ruled without Re and destroyed Egypt's temples. For her, recalling their crimes served a purpose. It cast her own reign as a renewal of divine harmony. By invoking the memory of Avaris and its foreign kings, she positioned herself as the guardian of Egypt's sacred order. Even more intriguing is the so-called 400-year stela, erected centuries later during the reign of Rameses II. The monument commemorates the worship of Seth, a god closely associated with the Hyksos dynasty. Though Seth had long been honored in the Delta, under the Hyksos he was merged with the Levantine storm god Baal and elevated to chief prominence in Avaris. By the New Kingdom, the association between Seth and foreign rule was inescapable. Yet here was a monument acknowledging his cult and tracing its continuity for centuries. This paradox reveals the complexity of Egyptian memory. Even as pharaohs condemned the Hyksos as enemies, they could not entirely erase the gods and traditions linked to them. Literary works also preserved their image. Texts composed in the New Kingdom recast the Hyksos period as a dark chapter in Egypt's past. They told of foreigners who corrupted the land, who brought disorder, who blasphemed against the gods. At the same time, these stories served as warnings. They reminded audiences that Egypt's strength could never again be allowed to falter, lest foreign rulers seize the throne. In this way, the Hyksos became mythic adversaries, used to teach lessons about vigilance and unity. Archaeological evidence reveals deliberate erasure. Monuments erected during Hyksos rule were defaced, their inscriptions chiseled away, their statues toppled. Scarabs bearing the names of kings like Khayan and Apophis were left buried, but official recognition of their reigns vanished from Egyptian king lists. In official records, it was as if they had never ruled, their dynasty excised from history. This act of historical cleansing reinforced the narrative that they were illegitimate intruders rather than rightful pharaohs. Yet the very need to erase them suggests how deeply they had once mattered. The Hyksos were not a minor disruption, but a dynasty that had ruled the Delta for more than a century. They had left behind cities, technologies, and connections that Egypt itself adopted. Erasure was never complete. Traces of their influence survived in every chariot wheel, every composite bow, every scarab seal. Egyptians might have denied their legitimacy, but they could not undo their legacy. The memory of Avaris was especially potent. To Egyptians of the New Kingdom, the ruined city symbolized foreign humiliation. Its fall under Ahmose was celebrated as a national triumph, retold again and again as proof of Egypt's resilience. Festivals and hymns likely commemorated the event, linking it to the divine order restored by native kings. Avaris, once a vibrant port of international culture, became in memory a cautionary ruin, its story retold to strengthen Egyptian pride. These memories eventually intersected with broader traditions. Centuries later, Jewish and Greco-Roman authors would interpret the story of the Hyksos through their own lenses, connecting it to the Exodus or to foreign invasions. But even within Egypt, the Hyksos lived on in a kind of cultural afterlife. They were remembered as villains, yet their contributions to warfare, trade, and religion persisted in daily life. Egyptians rode in chariots, worshipped Seth in certain regions, and traded with the Levant, all while condemning the very dynasty that had introduced such practices. This paradox shaped Egyptian identity. By remembering the Hyksos as a hated other, Egyptians reinforced their sense of unity and divine mission. At the same time, by adopting the innovations they had brought, Egypt positioned itself to become a true imperial power. The New Kingdom pharaohs who led armies into Canaan and Syria were using Hyksos tools to conquer lands once connected to Avaris. In a sense, the memory of the Hyksos was both rejected and absorbed, a duality that defined Egypt's golden age. The propaganda was powerful, but cracks in the narrative are visible. Even in texts that condemn them, the Hyksos are acknowledged as formidable foes. Sekinenre Tao's wounds, Kamosi's struggles, and Kamose's protracted sieges all testify to the Hyksos' strength. They were not remembered as weaklings, but as dangerous adversaries whose defeat brought glory to their conquerors. Egyptian pride demanded exaggeration, but it also respected the scale of the challenge. By the close of the New Kingdom, the Hyksos had become a distant memory. Their story folded into the larger saga of Egypt's triumphs. Yet their shadow lingered. Every time Egyptians spoke of foreign threats, echoes of the Hyksos returned. Every time a pharaoh proclaimed himself the protector of Egypt against outsiders, the memory of Avaris' fall was invoked. Their dynasty had ended, but their role in Egypt's imagination endured for centuries. The New Kingdom's obsession with memory and erasure ensured that the Hyksos were never forgotten, even as their monuments crumbled. To Egyptians, they remained a warning of vulnerability, a reminder that foreign powers could rule if Egypt allowed itself to weaken. Ironically, by trying so hard to erase them, the Egyptians ensured their story would survive. Centuries after the fall of Avaris, the ruins of the Hyksos capital still lay buried beneath the soils of the eastern delta. Egyptians themselves had tried to erase the dynasty from memory, chiseling their names from monuments and branding them foreign usurpers. Yet the story of the Hyksos did not disappear entirely. Fragments survived in inscriptions, in myths, and most significantly, in the writings of later historians who sought to reconstruct Egypt's past. Through their pens, Avaris re-entered the world of history, though often shrouded in confusion and controversy. The earliest sustained attempt to tell the Hyksos story came from Manetho, an Egyptian priest who lived in the 3rd century BC during the Ptolemaic era. Writing in Greek for an audience that included both Egyptians and Hellenistic rulers, Manetho compiled a comprehensive history of Egypt. His work divided pharaohs into dynasties, a system still used today, and among these dynasties he placed the rulers of the Hyksos. Manetho described them as shepherd kings who invaded Egypt, seized power, and ruled for generations from a city in the delta. That city, scholars later understood, was Avaris. Manetho's account shaped how later generations imagined the Hyksos. He emphasized their foreignness, portraying them as outsiders who entered Egypt by force. To him, they were not simply migrants or traders who rose within the delta, but invaders who overwhelmed the land. His interpretation reflected the memory preserved by Egyptian tradition. The Hyksos as oppressors whose defeat marked a restoration of order. But Manetho also preserved important details. He gave their dynasty a number, the 15th, and listed their kings. Names that echoed those preserved on scarabs and seals unearthed centuries later. Not all who read Manetho accepted his version without debate. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, seized upon the Hyksos story to connect it to the Hebrew Exodus. Quoting Manetho's passages, Josephus argued that the Hyksos were none other than the Israelites themselves, who entered Egypt, lived in the delta, and were later expelled. For him, the story of Avaris became a piece of evidence linking Jewish history to Egyptian records. He rejected the image of the Hyksos as oppressors, instead presenting them as ancestors of his own people. This interpretation sparked centuries of debate. Greek and Roman writers, reading Josephus, repeated the association between the Hyksos and the Exodus. Some saw the Hyksos as enslavers, others as slaves themselves. In either case, the city of Avaris became entangled in broader narratives about exile, liberation, and divine providence. What had once been the capital of Levantine rulers in Egypt now became, in the imagination of antiquity, a stage for biblical drama. The difficulty lay in chronology. Manetho's dates, passed down in fragments, did not always align with archaeological evidence. Josephus, eager to link Hyksos' expulsion to the Exodus, adjusted details to suit his purpose. Other authors, from Tacitus to later Byzantine chroniclers, added further layers of confusion. The Hyksos were remembered variously as invaders, slaves, Hebrews, or even lepers, depending on the source. In the absence of surviving Egyptian records, the memory of Avaris became a canvas onto which different cultures painted their own stories. Meanwhile, Egyptian traditions themselves remained ambivalent. Some inscriptions of the New Kingdom had celebrated the expulsion of the Hyksos with triumph, but others hinted at more complex legacies. The worship of Seth in the Delta, for example, continued long after the Hyksos were gone, reminding Egyptians of a god once central to Avaris' identity. Later priests could not ignore these traces, even as they repeated stories of foreign oppression. Thus, when Manetho wrote, he inherited both the official narrative of Hyksos villainy and the lived reality of their enduring cultural imprint. The rediscovery of Avaris in ancient texts highlights how history and memory intertwine. To the Egyptians, the Hyksos were a wound that never fully healed. To Josephus, they were an opportunity to connect sacred tradition to historical record. To Greek and Roman readers, they became symbols of foreign conquest, useful for moral or political lessons. Across all these accounts, the ruins of Avaris were never described directly. The city itself remained hidden beneath the delta mud, but its shadow loomed large in imagination. What makes these ancient accounts invaluable, despite their distortions, is that they preserved names and details otherwise lost. Without Manetho, we might not know of kings like Seleucus or Apophis. Without Josephus, we would not see how the Hyksos story resonated beyond Egypt, shaping identities far into the future. Even the errors, the chronological gaps, the conflations with the Exodus, reveal how powerful the memory of Avaris remained long after its stones were forgotten. As centuries passed, the location of Avaris slipped from knowledge. When later writers mentioned the Hyksos, they often confused their city with others in the delta, such as Tanis or even Memphis. The physical site lay buried beneath new settlements, its name fading from maps. Yet in the libraries of Alexandria, in the scrolls of Josephus, and in the annals of Greek historians, the city lived on as an idea, the place where foreign kings had once ruled Egypt. The rediscovery of Avaris by ancient historians thus represents a second life for the city. Though they never saw its ruins, writers like Manetho and Josephus gave it shape in memory. They turned it into a symbol of foreign domination, of liberation, of exile, of identity. Their words kept the city alive in cultural consciousness, even as the Nile deposited silt over its remains. In this way, Avaris never truly vanished. Long before modern archaeologists unearthed its walls, it had already been reborn in stories, myths, and polemics. Its image was fragmented and contested, but it endured. And as the ancient world moved into the age of Rome and Byzantium, the tale of the Hyksos would continue to echo, preparing the ground for later confusion about the ruins of the Delta. By the dawn of late Antiquity, the once proud capital of the Hyksos had slipped almost entirely into silence. The bustling harbours and painted palaces of Avaris were long gone, swallowed by mud, rebuilt over, and forgotten by the people who lived above its ruins. Yet traces of the city lingered, often in ways invisible to those who walked its soil. Stones were reused in nearby villages, names blurred into legend, and memories became confused with other delta towns. Avaris had entered a long twilight, one in which it survived more as a ghost than as a city. In the centuries after the New Kingdom, new centres of power rose in the eastern delta. Tanis, perched on a different branch of the Nile, emerged as a prominent city, housing temples and palaces of pharaohs who ruled in the first millennium BC. Later Greeks and Romans, visiting the delta, often mistook Tanis for the Hyksos capital described by Manetho and Josephus. The confusion persisted for generations, cementing Tanis in historical imagination as the city of the foreign rulers. This error would haunt archaeology for centuries, delaying the rediscovery of Avaris's true location. Meanwhile, Avaris itself endured in fragments. Its mud brick walls, left untended, melted back into the soil. Canals shifted, silting up old harbours and turning once busy docks into marshland. Farmers reclaimed fields over abandoned neighbourhoods, ploughing through layers of buried pottery and collapsed houses without realising what lay beneath. For locals, the ruins were simply part of the landscape, useful for scavenging building material but no longer recognizable as the seat of kings. Stone robbing was perhaps the most destructive force. Blocks from palaces and temples were hauled away to build homes, boundary walls, and even new shrines. Across Egypt, this practice was common. Monuments of past ages often became quarries for the present. The Hyksos city was no exception. Columns, lintels, and inscribed stones found second lives in neighboring towns, their original context forgotten. Some fragments ended up in temples at Tanis, adding to the confusion by making it appear that Tanis had been the Hyksos capital. The memory of the city faded not only in stone, but in story. Egyptian inscriptions ceased to mention Avaris, and later traditions blurred its identity. By the Greco-Roman era, the Hyksos were still remembered as foreign rulers, but their capital was misplaced. When Christian and early Islamic writers encountered tales of the Exodus, they sometimes linked them to delta cities they could see, Tanis, Pelusium, or even Memphis, rather than the buried site of Tel el-Dabba. Avaris disappeared beneath layers of both earth and misunderstanding. Yet the soil of the delta preserved what memory could not. Beneath farmland and villages, the strata of Tel el-Dabba held walls, streets, and cemeteries sealed in mud. Though no one in late antiquity or the Middle Ages recognized it, the physical city still slept intact. Donkey burials, palatial courtyards, and fresco fragments lay undisturbed, awaiting a future age of discovery. During the medieval period, the Nile Delta was a patchwork of rural settlements and fortified towns. Arab geographers described its canals, its fertile fields, and its shifting branches of the river, but they made no mention of Avaris. To them, it was invisible, swallowed by time. The nearby site that would later become P-Rameses, once the grand capital of Rameses II, left more prominent ruins and was more often remembered. Avaris, buried beneath, remained unknown. Still, faint echoes of the city lingered in legend. Local communities may have preserved vague memories of a great town destroyed in antiquity. Place names shifted, old mounds gained reputations as cursed or sacred, and farmers sometimes unearthed artifacts they could not explain. Pottery shards, scarabs, and stone fragments occasionally surfaced, but without the framework of archaeology, these discoveries could not restore the city's identity. They became curiosities, often lost again. The fate of Avaris in these centuries reflects a larger truth about the ancient world. Cities could rise to extraordinary prominence and then vanish almost completely. Without continuous settlement, monuments melted back into earth. Without written records, names vanished. What survived was often misremembered or reassigned to another place. Avaris suffered this fate to an unusual degree, eclipsed by Tanis and hidden beneath Pi-Rameses. By the Middle Ages, the city's silence was nearly complete. Only careful excavation, centuries later, would reveal its remains. Until then, the Hyksos capital lived only in the words of historians like Manetho and Josephus, disconnected from the actual landscape. The ground of Tel el-Dabba carried the weight of forgotten history, its secrets preserved under layers of Nile silt and farmland. When modern explorers eventually arrived, they would be misled by the same errors that had persisted since antiquity. They looked to Tanis, to Pelusium, to other delta mounds, convinced they were searching for the Hyksos capital. Generations would pass before the mistake was corrected. In this sense, the obscurity of Avaris in late antiquity and the medieval era shaped the very course of its rediscovery. The centuries of silence laid the stage for the drama of archaeology in the 19th and 20th centuries. The ruins of Avaris, therefore, lived two lives. One was physical, buried, and invisible beneath the delta. The other was textual, surviving in confused accounts that pointed to the wrong cities. Together, these lives ensured that Avaris remained both forgotten and remembered, erased, yet enduring. It would take modern science to bring the two back together, to match the buried city with the stories told by ancient writers. For centuries, Avaris had slept in silence beneath the delta, forgotten by locals and misplaced by historians. When the age of European exploration dawned in the 19th century, the buried city was still hidden under fields and villages. Yet its story was alive in texts, in Manetho's accounts of foreign kings, in Josephus's polemics, and in the biblical echoes of an exodus from Egypt. These fragments of memory lured scholars and adventurers northward, convinced that somewhere in the marshes of the eastern delta lay the lost capital of the Hyksos. Early explorers began with the cities they could see. Auguste Mariette, the pioneering French Egyptologist of the mid-19th century, dug at Tanis and Pelusium, sites long linked with the Hyksos by tradition. The ruins were impressive, temples of later dynasties, colossi of Rameses the Great, and sprawling cemeteries. Many believed these must be the remains of Avaris. For decades, Tanis in particular was identified as the Hyksos capital, supported by the fact that its monuments included blocks originally quarried from earlier sites. To Mariette and his successors, the connection seemed obvious. Flinders Petrie, another giant of early archaeology, added to the search. At Tanis, in the 1880s, he uncovered scarabs and pottery that hinted at foreign influence, strengthening the belief that this was the site of the Hyksos. His stratigraphic methods were groundbreaking, yet even he was misled by the accumulation of reused materials. The stones of Avaris, robbed in Antiquity and transplanted to other towns, had disguised the true location. The real city remained hidden, still waiting. The problem was compounded by the delta itself. Unlike the dry sands of Upper Egypt, the delta's wetlands buried and destroyed monuments quickly. Mud brick dissolved into soil, canals shifted course, and floods deposited silt over entire neighborhoods. Cities could vanish completely beneath farmland, leaving few surface traces. Archaeology in the delta was a challenge. Mounds were difficult to interpret, sites waterlogged, and the ancient geography obscured by millennia of change. Despite these obstacles, hints began to emerge in the 20th century. Egyptian scholars, such as Labib Habachi, advanced theories that Avaris lay not at Tanis, but at Tel El Daba, a mound in the eastern delta near modern Qantir. Habachi recognized patterns in the landscape and inscriptions that pointed toward this neglected site. His insights, though initially overlooked, planted the seed for later discoveries. It was not until 1966 that a decisive breakthrough came. The Austrian archaeologist Manfred Bietak launched systematic excavations at Tel El Daba, combining stratigraphy with large-scale surveys of the area. What he found astonished the scholarly world. Layer by layer, the soil revealed palatial districts, temples, workshops, and cemeteries stretching across centuries. The material matched perfectly with descriptions of Avaris in ancient texts. Scarabs bore the names of Hyksos kings. Temples honored Seth Baal. Fresco fragments painted in the Minoan style emerged from palace walls. The lost capital of the Hyksos had finally been found. Bietak's work overturned generations of mistaken assumptions. Tanis was no longer the city of the Hyksos. It had simply inherited stones and monuments from elsewhere. The true Avaris was here, buried under Tel El Daba and overlapping with the later city of Pi Rameses. Stratigraphy revealed continuous occupation from the Middle Kingdom, through the Hyksos era and beyond, a span of 6 centuries. The city had not only existed, but thrived, leaving behind a record more detailed than anyone had imagined. The discoveries captured the imagination of both scholars and the public. Minoan frescoes showing bull leaping and marine life proved that Avaris had direct links to the Aegean. Vast harbour installations revealed a city deeply embedded in Mediterranean trade. Donkey burials, Levantine-style houses, and mass-produced scarabs confirmed its Asiatic character. What had been a ghost in texts became a tangible city, its streets and rituals brought back to light. Throughout the late 20th century, excavations at Tel el-Dabba continued, refining the picture of Avaris. Palatial District F emerged as the seat of Hyksos kings. Temples dedicated to Seth Baal showed how religion blended across cultures. Cemeteries displayed the coexistence of Egyptian and Canaanite burial customs. Every trench deepened the understanding of a city once described only in hostile propaganda. Avaris was no longer just the symbol of foreign oppression. It was revealed as one of the most cosmopolitan cities of the Bronze Age. The rediscovery also reignited debates about biblical history. If Avaris was the Hyksos capital, could its expulsion connect to the Exodus traditions remembered in later centuries? Scholars argued fiercely, pointing to the timing of its fall around 1550 BC and comparing it to possible biblical chronologies. Some saw in the archaeology echoes of stories of displacement and migration. Others urged caution, reminding that centuries separated the Hyksos expulsion from the traditional dates of the Exodus. Regardless of interpretation, Avaris became central to discussions about how memory, myth, and archaeology intersect. By the end of the 20th century, the transformation was complete. The city, once erased from Egyptian records, misidentified by generations of scholars and buried beneath the delta, was restored to history. Avaris had awakened again, its palaces, frescoes, and cemeteries telling stories silenced for millennia. The road to rediscovery had been long. It wound through the errors of Greek historians, the misplaced certainties of early Egyptology, and the challenges of Delta archaeology. Yet persistence revealed the truth. Avaris had never been lost. It had only been hidden, waiting for the right eyes and tools to bring it back to light. When historians finally peeled back the layers of Tel el-Dabba, they found not only the ruins of a city, but the restoration of a story erased for centuries. Avaris, once capital of the Hyksos, stood revealed in all its complexity, a metropolis of traders and soldiers, of Asiatic migrants and Egyptian villagers, of gods who merged across cultures and palaces decorated with foreign art. Its rediscovery transformed how we understand Egypt's Bronze Age and redefined the legacy of the so-called foreign kings. Manfred Beertach's excavations, beginning in 1966, brought extraordinary clarity. Stratigraphy revealed more than 6 centuries of continuous occupation, from the humble hamlets of the Middle Kingdom to the sprawling palaces of the Hyksos and the garrisons of the New Kingdom. Each stratum told a story. The earliest Levantine houses, the great expansion of the city into a harbour metropolis, the Hyksos palatial quarter, and the decline after a Moses conquest. The soil preserved the memory Egyptians had tried to erase. The finds were spectacular. Frescoes painted in unmistakably Minoan style adorned palace walls. Dolphins, bull leapers, and spirals in brilliant blues and reds. These fragments proved that Avaris was directly linked to the Aegean world, centuries before Mycenaean warriors strode onto the Mediterranean stage. Vast harbour installations, with wharves and basins large enough to accommodate fleets, showed that the city was Egypt's greatest maritime hub of its age. Palatial District F revealed columned halls and storage magazines where tribute and goods flowed in from across the Near East. Temples dedicated to Seth Baal confirmed the religious fusion that defined the city. Here, Egyptian priests and Levantine worshippers prayed to a storm god who embodied both traditions. Cemeteries uncovered in the city revealed crouched Asiatic burials alongside extended Egyptian ones, often accompanied by donkey sacrifices unique to Canaanite ritual. These finds made tangible the cultural hybridity that textual sources had only hinted at. The discoveries extended far beyond Egypt itself. Scarabs inscribed with the names of Hyksos kings, found as far away as Crete, Babylon, and Anatolia, were now understood in context. They testified to a city whose reach spanned the Mediterranean and the Near East. Avaris had not been a provincial stronghold of foreigners, but a cosmopolitan capital at the heart of Bronze Age networks. For scholars, the rediscovery of Avaris demanded a reassessment of the Hyksos. No longer could they be dismissed simply as invaders or oppressors. The traces revealed their role as innovators, merchants, and bridge builders between cultures. They introduced technologies, the horse, chariot, composite bow, that Egypt not only adopted but perfected. They established trade routes that later pharaohs would exploit to build an empire. They reshaped Egyptian religion by elevating Seth in ways that endured long after their fall. The city also reignited debates about the Exodus. The evidence showed that Avaris' fall occurred around 1550 BC, close in spirit, if not in date, to biblical traditions of an Israelite departure from Egypt. Josephus had already equated the Hyksos expulsion with the Exodus, and modern scholars revisited the question with new urgency. Some argued that memories of the Hyksos, distorted and retold, may have merged with later migrations to form the biblical story. Others insisted the two events were separate, separated by centuries. Whatever the answer, Avaris remains central to the discussion. Its ruins a meeting ground between archaeology and sacred tradition. As excavations continued into the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the significance of Avaris only grew. The site revealed layers of daily life, workshops filled with pottery, houses decorated with Levantine motifs, children's toys carved from bone. These small details brought humanity to the city, reminding us that behind the grand battles and royal proclamations were families who cooked meals, raised children, and prayed for protection. Avaris was not only a capital of kings, it was a living city of tens of thousands, their stories preserved in shards and bones. Modern Egypt has embraced these discoveries as part of its heritage. The story of Avaris is no longer simply the tale of foreign rulers, but a chapter in the long history of the Nile Valley. Museums in Cairo and abroad display artifacts from Tel el-Daba, from scarabs to fresco fragments, introducing audiences to the city that once stood at the crossroads of worlds. For Egyptologists, Avaris has become a touchstone, proof of how archaeology can resurrect entire civilizations once thought lost. The rediscovery also carries a broader lesson. For centuries, the Hyksos were known only through the hostile words of their enemies, remembered as oppressors expelled in triumph. Archaeology overturned that narrative, showing that history is rarely so simple. Avaris was not merely a symbol of foreign domination, but a place of innovation, trade, and cultural blending. Its fall was dramatic, but its legacy endured in the very empire that conquered it. Today, when scholars walk the fields of Tel el-Daba, they tread on layers that span the full arc of the city's life. From the first Levantine migrants who built modest houses in 2000 BC, to the Hyksos kings who presided over palaces and harbours in 1600 BC, to the Egyptian garrisons who repurposed the site after 1540 BC. Each layer speaks of resilience, adaptation, and transformation. The story of Avaris is, in the end, the story of Egypt itself, a land defined by the Nile, yet shaped by connections beyond its borders, a civilization both insular and cosmopolitan, vulnerable yet enduring. The Lost City reminds us that history is not only written in victories, but also buried in ruins, waiting for rediscovery. From a forgotten mound in the Delta to the centerpiece of modern scholarship, Avaris has reclaimed its place. Its palaces may be broken, its harbors silted, but its story once again flows like the Nile, carrying with it the voices of kings, traders, and families who lived on the edge of empires. The lost city has been brought back to light, and in that light, it shines as one of the most important cities of the Bronze Age world.